If you take one step, then you will be a little closer to your dream than if you stay just where you are.
Welcome to Coming Home Well. I'm your guest host, Liz Booker, a retired Coast Guard helicopter pilot and writer on a mission to influence the demographics of aviation through story. As literary aviatrix, I have built a community of readers and writers around books featuring women in aviation, and have interviewed authors about their books and their writing and publishing journeys. A large portion of these stories reflect the ways in which aviation history is indelibly linked to military history. This interview is a rebroadcast of the Aviatrix Book Review podcast in collaboration with Coming Home Well. While my interviews span the diversity of aviation experiences, I hope the ones that are featured here will educate and inspire those who listen. These are human stories of grit and courage, failure and success that happen to be about women in military aviation from around the world throughout our history.
Here I am, I'm ready to go again, ready to say goodbye when the sky is high. No reason to stay on ground. Lift your hands and you can touch and fly.
Hello and welcome. I'm Liz Booker, literary aviatrix, and I'm excited to be celebrating the launch of a new book, Fly Girls Revolt, the story of the women who kicked open the door to fly in combat. And I'm thrilled to have the author on. Eileen Bjorkman, welcome.
Thank you, Liz.
I'm so excited to talk to you about this. I understand that the book is going to be available on May 23rd, but it's available for pre-order now. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, super. Can you give us a summary of the book?
So the title, I think, pretty much is self-explanatory, the story of the women who kicked open the door to fly in combat. The focus of the book is really the women military aviators of the 70s and 80s who made that final push to kick the door open. But it also includes, it starts back in World War II. So it includes the story of the earlier women who flew military aircraft, the WASP. I think most of your viewers are probably familiar with the WASP. And then it goes into the early days of women being members of the military after World War II through Korea and Vietnam. And then all of the movements that happened in the United States, the women's movement, how that contributed to women gradually gaining more and more rights within the military. And then eventually starting their training in the 70s and 80s. They had limits put on them, though. They couldn't fly combat aircraft because of a law that was passed in 1948 that said women couldn't engage the enemy in combat in a combat aircraft, and they couldn't serve on combat ships. So that really limited the women's careers in terms of what they could do. Nothing wrong with flying cargo aircraft, support aircraft, but if you're going to achieve the top ranks of the military, it's best to be flying combat aircraft. You know, if you're in a flying career field. So there were limits on the women's careers. It also wasn't fair to the commanders of units who wouldn't get the best qualified people. You could have a woman who graduated at the top of her pilot training class. Normally, she would have gotten a fighter or a bomber if that's what she wanted to do, and she would, have to go off and fly a tanker or a transport aircraft. Again, nothing wrong with that, but you're not putting your best qualified people in your most demanding airplanes that way. So anyway, long story short, Desert Storm happened, a lot happened there, proved that women could do things, and then that eventually led to the legislation being overturned, and then the laws being overturned. Then a couple of years later, the policies changed, and women in 1993, we're coming up on the 30th anniversary, in fact, were allowed to start flying combat aircraft.
You outlined that so well, all of that so well in the book. And for those of you who are watching, I pulled out some props today. My Coast Guard stuff, just in solidarity with the women in the other services. I was always very proud to be a member of a service that did not have any restrictions on any opportunities in the service. Even our most demanding physical rate of rescue swimmer, aviation survival technician, all women had to do was meet the same requirements as the men, and several did. Not many, but, all of the opportunities in the Coast Guard were open. And so I was thrilled for the women when that happened, but sad for the ones that had to try and navigate careers, some of whom are my friends now through this project. Without those opportunities to progress. So you did that really well. And one of my favorite things about this book is the way that you bridged the 1940s to the 1970s. I don't know if I have read that in any other books specifically about women in aviation. I'm sure there are some military histories that I haven't read yet that do that. But because women weren't flying during that period, we don't typically read about them in our books. And so I loved the way that you kind of gave us those breadcrumbs to show what women who even weren't flying were doing for us. We stand on their shoulders as well, not just the women aviators. And so I really appreciated the way that you detailed that in the book. And there's something else about the book that you didn't mention. It's partially a memoir. You put you kind of weave your own experiences and where you come into that history. And there were parts of it where I was wishing for more Eileen. Could you tell us a little bit about your career and what you're doing now?
Yeah. So I came in 1980. So I had a front row seat to all of this, happening I didn't see explicitly what happened in the 70s, but because I came in the 80s, I heard all the stories and knew people who were around in the 70s and were living all of that. I initially decided to become a flight test engineer. Once I joined the Air Force, I got interested in flying. I thought, well, my eyes aren't good enough to be a pilot. And I debated about maybe becoming a navigator because I figured I could pass the navigator vision. But looking at it, I would have been flying 141s or something, nothing wrong with that. But I really wanted to fly fighters, I think like a lot of women. And I discovered that you could be a flight test engineer and fly in the backseat of fighters. And I thought, why not try to do that? I was studying to be an engineer. The Air Force wanted me to be an engineer. And so to me, it just made sense. And so I became a flight test engineer. My first flight test engineer job, I was at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, testing inertial navigation systems. And we tested those on cargo airplanes. So I didn't get to fly in fighters on my first flight test engineer assignment. But then I got selected for test pilot school. Test pilot school doesn't just train test pilots. They also train test navigators, test engineers, and a variety of folks. And so I got selected as an engineer. And then while I was there, I started flying in the backseat of F4s and then later in F-16s. And so it was just a great way to be able to fly a fighter, but also being in the test business. I just found that I just loved being in the test business. I loved testing new equipment, bringing new operational capabilities to the field. That was just something that really resonated with me. And so I was kind of in the test business off and on through my whole career. Once you get a little bit older, it's hard to stay in one career, in the military, at least in the Air Force. So I wound up kind of bouncing around a little bit, doing some staff jobs, but ultimately I kept coming back to the test business. And I'm actually now the executive director at the Air Force Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base. A job I certainly would never have thought I would have gotten when I was captain.
Yeah. So what rank did you leave from the Air Force?
I retired as a colonel in 2010. And it wasn't really my intention to come back as a government civilian, but there were some opportunities there and I just sort of fell into it. And so I did a couple jobs at the Pentagon and some job at Air Force Materiel Command at Wright-Patt, and then came out to Edwards in the fall of 2019 to start
as
the
a
job.
Senior executive. Is that right?
As a senior executive, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Congratulations on an amazing career and navigating, not just pilots we're in the minority, certainly engineers as well. So it's great to have your representation and then also to have your lens on this story. Having, it could have been written by a pilot, but it's kind of fun that it wasn't. You kind of get to see more than just the pilot's experience, and maybe a little more objective view of what was going on during that time. So great job on the book, and I'm so glad that you bring your experience to that. So why did you write the book?
A lot of it was just that I didn't see anything written about women from our generation, my generation. Mm-hmm. I think you're younger than me, so but I think you're kind of at the tail end of my generation. So I saw a lot of stuff about the WASP. There actually have been quite a few books written about the WASP. Even when I was younger, I knew their story. I think it's getting out there more and more, but there were books written about the WASP even when I was younger. And then I see a lot of memoirs about women who have flown in combat, and they're great. I love reading those books, and I love the fact that they had the opportunity to do that. But there's almost nothing about our generation. And so I thought, this is a book that really needs to be written. And so as I started to write it, initially it was going to be just about our generation. But as I started to write it, I realized that, again, we stood on the shoulders, not just of the WASP, but of all the other women before us. And I just happened to know somebody in my private life who was a veteran of the Air Force from back in the early 60s. That was Claire Griffith, who's in the book there. and it was just a coincidence. I mean, there weren't that many women that were in the military in those days. And it's just a coincidence that I happened to know her. And I realized that she had an amazing story too. And there were all these other stories. And so that's why I wanted to make sure that I didn't just capture our stories, but also captured that previous generation. Because like you said, we all stood on the shoulders of each other, and there were little gains made a little bit at a time. And I think that's kind of one of the themes of the book, is that this wasn't like all of a sudden people woke up in 1993 and said, oh, women should get to fly in combat. And it was just this gradual over 50 years, getting women more and more equal in the military and giving them more opportunities. And that was kind of the last big push, at least on the aviation side.
Yeah. Well, so when you decided to write the book, how did you go about the research? Tell us about that.
So I started initially just with an outline based on what I already knew. And then that told me, okay, here's the areas where I need to fill in. I started out actually with some interviews of women that I knew from when I had been in the military. So I tracked down some women from that time frame. When I ran out of people that I knew to be able to talk to, then I went to Women Military Aviators. Actually, that was probably kind of the best next step that I took. I think that I was able to get access to a lot of women. First, initially I was just looking for, women in the first, pilot training class or somewhere around in there. So talking to the early women. And then I also was able to talk to some of the women who went through the Air Force Academy, the first class of women at the Air Force Academy. I did focus the book very much on Air Force because I'm Air Force. It probably comes through in the book. I try to talk about all the services, but it is very Air Force centric. But the WMA was really instrumental in getting me those initial interviews that again started to kind of shape the tone of the book and the themes and all that kind of stuff. I also accessed the Air Force Academy has an outstanding collection of oral interviews. And so I used a lot of those oral interviews. I just went through, there's literally hundreds of them. I went through and picked some of them out. And the Library of Congress has a good interview of Jeanne Holm, one of the women mostly from the 60s and 70s, first woman who was a general officer in the Air Force. So all of that, the oral histories I thought were extremely helpful. That especially helped with the early days of the women in the Air Force. And then the two archives I used the most were the Texas Women's University has the WMA archives, and also some archives of a group called WHEEL, Women's Equity Action League. And so I went down and mined all of that. There was just tons and tons of material on there. And then the last place I went physically was the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base. And that's where I found some real gems. There was a ton of material in there from the early women in the Air Force days, and a lot of stuff that Jeanne Holm had written in the 60s regarding women serving in Vietnam. And there was just a ton of material in there that I had never seen published anywhere before. So that was just a real gold mine.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah. Yeah. Again, you told us things that I haven't read anywhere else. That doesn't mean that they aren't in some other sort of more broad histories about women in aviation, or women in the military in general, but I was really excited to read those. So thank you so much for the work that you did to dig up those stories. That's amazing.
Thanks.
So there were a lot of things in this book that we've heard. There are some common themes. We start with the WASP. And so I'd like to start there just really quickly and very specifically about Jackie Cochran. Jackie is such this a fascinating character to me, and I don't pretend to have read everything written about her or by her yet, but I keep making my way through the canon. And I saw that you kind of came away there. Jackie can be very divisive in our community. There are some people who absolutely are just 100% diehard Jackie fans, and there are others who are extremely critical of her. I think she's just very complex, and it seemed like I was kind of reading that from you too. You kind of cover it in the book, but what were your impressions of Jackie Cochran overall?
I think complex is the best term. Yes, I that's how I feel about her as well. She certainly did a lot for women in aviation. She certainly was an accomplished aviator. I would never take any of that away from her. But like you said, she was very complex. She often did things that were actually detrimental to women in aviation, I felt. So that didn't come through so much in the early days, the formation of the WASP and everything. Obviously, there were some rivalries there with Nancy Love. I think that comes through in pretty much any book that you read, or anything that you read about the two of them. So that's not just a cursory history. I tried not to dwell on that. I tried to just focus on the women actually doing what they did during World War II and not get into all the details of that.
Yeah.
So, but it was later. I was quite shocked to find out the study that she did in the early 50s about the women in the Air Force. She was extremely critical of what was going on. She didn't even do what she was asked to do in the study, and it caused this huge uproar, and it brought a negative light to the women in the Air Force that almost killed them. They could have easily just disappeared as a result of what she did. Fortunately, they didn't. I think there were enough people around that felt that they were necessary, that they wound up, surviving. But it was one of those things that, you go, why did she even do that? Was it because she wanted to be in charge of women in the Air Force? Or she very much seemed to me like she wanted to be in control all the time. That came through with the space, the Mercury 13 as well. It's like, well, she wants women to go into space, but only if she can be in control of that. That's the way it came across to me. And then later on, she testified against women attending the military academies. And she thought that women shouldn't be flying in combat airplanes, even though back in World War II, she had explicitly said that the WASP could have flown in combat if they'd had to. And it just seemed like there were all these contradictions all the time. And I tried to capture all that, and I tried not to be, too, I'm trying to think of the right word. I just tried to capture what happened, as opposed to,
and not editorialize on it.
Yeah. I tried not to pass judgment, but at the same time because I was always kind of I would say when I was younger, I bought into the legendary Cochran, who grew up in poverty and all, and did all these amazing things, and then I start reading all this other stuff and I'm like, wait a minute. Yeah.
Isn't that a heartbreak when someone is your childhood hero and then you find out who they really were? That happened to me recently. That happened to me recently about another aviator, and I was like, oh, that's a male. But anyway, yeah. Oh. Yeah.
And one thing that happened, I didn't include this in the book, but one of the things I discovered was there was in her her second autobiography. So she's actually got two. So yeah, her second autobiography, she had a series of stories in there and I thought, this is awesome. It was just this really dramatic stuff. And I started to, use some of that material as kind of my introduction to her. But then when I went back, because I fact check everything, I don't just take what somebody says for gospel. Yeah. I go back and read the newspapers. I find the stuff, and there's no way what she wrote could have happened. I think all of the individual things that happened, but they did not happen in the sequence that she put them in. And when you put them in the right sequence, it was not nearly, it was still dramatic, but it was not nearly as dramatic as she made it out to be. And so I removed a lot of material once I discovered that. I was like, man, and I don't know if she did that on purpose or if she just memory, conflated things. It's hard. Again, I don't want to be judgmental, but at the same time, I found it very difficult to use anything that she wrote. I felt like anything she wrote, especially, I had to go back and take with a grain of salt and go back and really fact check it meticulously.
Yeah. Somebody did an icebreaker at a little pilots get together once, and they asked if you could sit down with any figure in aviation history, who would it be? And for me, it's definitely Jackie Cochran, but she would have to be honest about what her motivations were in every scenario. Right. Like, I want to understand, like, what are your motivations here? Because there were times when she was absolutely championing us and women's advancement, and other times where I thought she was pandering to societal expectations and the men's, opinions in order to maintain her status and credibility with them. So that would be a fascinating conversation. Yes. So, yeah.
Great.
So are there any other things that you wanted to talk about the WASP in particular before we kind of move into some other topics?
No, I can't think of anything. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so, you kind of already outlined this bridge that I mentioned from the 1940s into 1970s. And then we get women into the academies, we get them into flight training finally. And then I mentioned recurring themes before, and I'm just going to list a few that show up repeatedly and showed up, many of them in my own career. And some of them are a little edgy. So first of all, uniforms and PPE. That's an easy one, and that's pretty benign. I mean, even I was having problems with that. People still have problems with that in the services. It's just like, why can't we figure this out? We've only been doing this for more than 50 years at this point. But you mentioned your stories about bladder control and strategic dehydration, which I want to talk about a little bit more. Pornography and the very creative ways in which the women handled that, and crying. That was another thing that was really interesting that I don't think I've seen in too many other books, other than, maybe one of the authors saying, I didn't want them to see me cry. But so let's start with that. Let's start with the crying. I want to say, as someone who had moments in my career where tears came, and I didn't want them to in that moment, and it was embarrassing, and I was, mortified that it happened. When I got more senior and I was the detailer, the human resources manager for the pilots in the Coast Guard, and then the chief pilot, I'm here to tell you I had a box of Kleenex on my desk, and it wasn't for the women, because there were guys crying all the time, but we put so much pressure. It's just a normal human emotional reaction, and we put so much pressure on ourselves not to do it. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, no, I agree. Because I was the same way. I never wanted to cry in front of anybody. Yeah. And right. There were a couple, I never actually broke down into tears in front of a guy, in front of the men, but there were a couple times when I left a meeting because I was about to cry, and I didn't want them to see me cry. And I would, go into the bathroom and get myself together, and then come back. But yeah, I felt very strongly about that. But you're right. I mean, I've seen guys cry too, and
plenty of guys in my office crying.
There was one of the worst moments of my career actually was when I was a squadron commander, and I had a small little laboratory within my squadron. It was a test squadron. We had this little laboratory. I think there was only about 3 people that worked there. Anyway, we had to shut it down for budget reasons, and we tried to keep this thing open. Trust me, we tried as hard as we could. And the guy that ran it was a senior, an older civilian. So He was probably in his, I'm in my 60s now, but, he seemed old to me. He was in his 60s, probably. And, and I talked to him over and over and over again about why we were going to have to do this if we had to do it. And anyway, the final day when I brought him into my office and told him that, hey, I'm sorry, we've done everything we can. We're going to have to shut this down. And he started crying. And I thought, oh my gosh, I have just ruined this guy's life. This is like everything he's worked for his whole life is running this little lab. And I'm like pulling the rug out from underneath him. And I just, like I said, I felt horrible, and so, yes, so men cry too. And then the other thing too, I think is that, men often react with anger. And so what's the difference between a woman having a few tears running down her face in a meeting and a guy pounding on the table, right?
Right.
In both cases, you've lost it a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And so why is pounding on the table okay, but having a few tears coming down your cheeks is not okay?
Because it's a cultural norm that
exactly right.
Yeah. But you're right. You're absolutely right. Both are displays of losing control of your emotions. So
right. Mm-hmm.
And then the bladder control and strategic dehydration, you include this, an incident in which you were in an aircraft and the last thing in the world you wanted to do was to end the flight because you had to go to the bathroom.
Right.
Which is, and I totally lived that too, which is absolutely absurd, isn't it? Because
it is.
The men can take care of it in the aircraft. Although in my particular aircraft, it would have been awkward, but because we were sitting side by side and usually wearing a dry suit. And I do know of stories where guys just went in their dry suit, but it's just so like and I'm 20 years after you, like we're just so concerned about being seen as weak and that we perceived as a weakness. And, women still have to deal with this stuff. There's some remedies that I've heard. And I have my own story about wearing Depends for my first couple of flights.
Yeah.
I stopped after I never
thought to do that. I wish I had.
I was like, I'm not gonna be the girl who has to pee during flight. I'm gonna take care of this with Depends. Anyway, it didn't work out. I have stage fright. So anyway, that scene was really, I could really identify with that, issue. And I loved your creative way of getting that flight over as quickly as you could.
Yeah. I was like, go fast. Yeah.
Yeah. So people will have to read the book to read that one. It's great. I loved it. And then there's the sexual harassment thing, which is a theme that we see, which even you had a little bit of in your career, which I was fortunate to escape that, but plenty of other harassment in other ways. So
yeah.
So then we get to the 70s the 80s and going into the 90s where women are trying to get into combat so that they can have, the normal career progression. And you get to this name in the book that I didn't recognize at first, Jeannie Flynn, and you start talking about what an overachiever, amazing, clearly competent, best in that entire group of aviators who were in training at the time, who put it on record that she was going to ask for Jets talk about Jeannie.
Yeah, so
who is General?
Yeah, she's now General Jeannie Leavitt. So yeah. So she came in, I think in 92, or late 91, went to pilot training. And by then the laws had changed, but the policy hadn't yet. And she knew that. She did very well in her pilot training class. As you pointed out, she was the #1 graduate at Laughlin Air Force Base. And so the way they did it was, and I think they still do something similar. There were, I think, 4 pilot training bases, and they would go around to each pilot training base. The #1 from Laughlin would pick, then the #1 from Columbus, that sort of thing. So, And they did it over a phone. It was a big conference call that they did in those days. So they probably do it over Zoom now, but yeah, they did it over the phone in a big conference call. They all got together in a room, in each location. And the way they would do it is Laughlin's turn. It was Laughlin's turn that time to go first. And then the next time they would have, like, say, Columbus go first or one of the other bases. So it was their turn. And she even told her wing commander she was going to do that. She said, I want to put down my marker. I want to ask for a fighter. I know they won't give it to me, but I want to do that. And even though I think it really surprised everybody when she came on the line and said, I'll take the F-15E, she's very confident about, I'll take the F-15E. And it was actually, everybody knew it was, the senior people knew it was going to happen. The colonel that was on the other end, he was well prepared. He wasn't like, he had a little piece of paper he'd written something down on. Sorry, you can't do that, and so, but they knew, they said, hey, that was pretty gutsy. She put down her marker. And then when the policy changed, just a couple of months later, I think it was 3 months later when the policy changed, they went back and she was their number one choice to bring back to be, one of the first women fighter pilots. So her ploy worked. So yeah.
Well, I feel very honored to, especially after reading that story, because I didn't know much about her, but I do see her like in the women military aviator circles, and I've talked to her a few times. And so it was just really fun to read that story and the stories of all the others. And I guess I do want to mention, I've said this before in the context of this sort of sister book to this, Wings of Gold, which is about the first naval aviators. And I do consider these two to be very complementary because you each cover different parts of this history and very well. But before I read Wings of Gold, and then you gave us a little bit more detail on this, I only knew WMA from Women in Aviation International conferences and the Friday night socials, flight suit socials. So I knew that they were doing good things, and it was a great group. I got to meet WASPs and Night Witches in that context, and so that was exciting. But I didn't know their history, and you brought it out here too when they were going before the congressional committee. Was that what it was? Yeah, where they all came out in force. Right. And very specifically how they shut down the general. Just talk a little bit about the WMA and what they did there.
Yeah. So I was familiar with WMA from, I had a friend who was, a pilot in the late 80s and she was in WMA. And so I was actually familiar with the organization. But I didn't really know that much about him, because I think at that time they were only taking pilots. They have kind of gone, they now pretty much take all women military aviators. But I think at one time they were only taking pilots and stuff. But anyway, so I was familiar with that group. And so I obviously, when I started doing this research, that was, one of the groups that I wanted to reach out to and talk to. And I was familiar with the McPeak incident, where they took on McPeak. And so, I was able to do a little bit more research and try to, recreate that scene all the way. So, but the summary of the scene is that it was very close to the time when when they were about to announce that they were going to overturn, that they were the policy, they were going to change the policy. So it was early April of 1993. And they were actually just a few weeks away from announcing that they were going to allow women to fly in combat aircraft. Anyway, there was a meeting of this group called DACOWITZ, Defense. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it's basically a group that looks at women's issues in the military. It's a civilian group that comes together, a committee, and they look at issues in the military and they advocate for change for women in the military. And anyway, they were having their annual meeting. It was just outside of Washington, D.C. And General McPeak, Merrill McPeak, who was the chief of staff of the Air Force, was going to be addressing the DACOWITZ about an issue that was impacting women pilots. Because not only were women not allowed to fly in combat aircraft, but the Air Force was going to a two-track pilot training system, where previously everybody flew the T-37, then the T-38, and then they went off and to whatever they were going to fly after that. they were going to go to a system that was more like what the Navy has, where everybody starts out in the T-37, and then they put you on either a tanker transport track or a fighter bomber track. And only the fighter bomber track people would get to go fly the T-38. And of course, that was going to preclude women from flying the T-38, which was, prior to that, a viable career field that they could be instructor pilots in T-38s. So the women were, DACOWITZ was upset about this, and they wanted McPeak to address them. Well, it turned into all the women military aviators showed up at this meeting in force. And as soon as he was done with telling them why they were going to this 2-track system, and sorry, it's not fair to women, but there's nothing we can do about it. And the women just attacked and going on, attacking him about his views on women in combat. And he had been one of the most vocal opponents of women flying in combat aircraft. The other service chiefs were against it as well, but he was the one that was the most vocal about it and had gotten the most press. And so anyway, it was a pretty amazing scene. And I won't go into all the gory details and anything here, but
there are such good details. The ladies had a strategy there that I thought was brilliant, and a lot of teamwork, and I loved it. So yes, thanks for telling that story more in depth. Go read the book to find out more about that. I loved it.
One of the things I've always wondered about, and I've in some ways I would love to interview General McPeak. I never did. But in some ways I would love to interview him. I've always wondered if he knew the policy was about to change, though, even when he went to that meeting, because, it changed just a few weeks later. And they almost never do anything fast.
Well, with the follow-on comments that you include in your book, he says, I was voicing my concerns, although normally we wouldn't do that publicly, right? We would voice it to our commanders in private. But he was voicing his concerns. But then he was like, but now the decision's made, and I salute and we carry forward. So
I just, because it wasn't long after that he called, and I don't have the exact date, but it wasn't long after that he called the people at, Air Force Personnel Center and said, hey, go find me 10 women pilots that can be our first fighter pilots, right? So that's why I kind of wonder, did he do that just because he knew it was about to change, or did he just do that because, I don't know. I've just always wondered. He's another person I think is very complex. So I think he'd actually be a great person to write a biography of. So I'm probably not the right person to do it, but he's another person that did both a lot of good for the Air Force, and also you kind of go, what were you thinking there, guy?
Interesting. Okay. Yep, they exist. Well, so when you were working on this book, was there anything that surprised you? Obviously you were living in tandem with all of this history. Did you find anything that surprised you?
There were two things I would say, and one of them was on the WASP. There was one other thing I wanted to mention that I forgot, was some of the WASP actually did come back into the military after they served, and they weren't militarized during World War II, but they were all. I was surprised to learn that they were all actually commissioned as reservists. They were commissioned as lieutenants, reservists after World War II, and they were put into an inactive status. And then some of them came back on active duty and served in, I think, primarily the Air Force. There may have been some that served in other services that I'm not aware of, but several of them served in the Air Force, but they weren't allowed to fly. So they served as like intelligence officers. Pat Pateman, who has done a lot of writing and stuff. I think some of the viewers might be familiar with her name. She served in the Air Force. She served during the Korean War. And then she actually was in Vietnam for a period of time as well as an intelligence officer. So that was one of the things that surprised me, was I didn't realize that some of them had actually come back on active duty like that. And then the other thing that surprised me was from the 1980s. Like I said, a lot of the initial outline of the book and some of my initial writing and thoughts was based on my own experiences. And I thought, based on what I observed as a young lieutenant and captain in the 1980s, early 1980s, I thought the Reagan administration was very much against women in the military. It just appeared that way to me.
Right.
And then reading the book, doing my research, I I found that it wasn't really the Reagan administration that was causing problems. Now, they were not, I would say, strong advocates for women. They certainly weren't in favor of like bringing in lots more women. They weren't in favor of putting women in combat, that sort of a thing. So, but they also were not against women. But there were a lot of people in the services at the time in Department of Defense that thought that there were too many women in the military. And they were the ones, they I think assumed when the Reagan administration came in that, oh, we can finally get rid of all these women. Well, so they started doing all these studies and trying to do things to, make women go backwards. And it was them. That was what I was seeing, was them, not the Reagan administration itself. The Reagan administration itself was, I think, fairly neutral on the topic. So I had to kind of recalibrate some of my, thinking about what happened in the 1980s, because I had just viewed it from this one perspective. And like I said, when I did my research, I learned that I was wrong. And so that was actually an interesting surprise. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Were there any other interesting details or stories that you would have liked to include that didn't really fit the story that you had to leave out?
Oh yeah, there was a ton of stuff that didn't make it in just because, you just run out of room, right? I had about 80,000 words and I had to cut a ton of stuff out of the Vietnam section. There were just many good stories about women serving in Vietnam that I just could not possibly get them all in. And in some cases I cut material that is actually in other books. So, there's a book called Angel's Truck Stop, I think. So, that's a very good book about a woman who served. She, ran the officers club over, I can't remember which base. It was one of the bases in Thailand. So she has wonderful, wonderful stories. And I had originally planned to include a little bit about her and her experience over there. But again, there just wasn't room. And she has a book out anyway. So I thought, well, people could read about it. And that was some of the reasons I left some things out, was because I felt like, well, it is covered in other places. So, but there was, it was really, really difficult. The Vietnam material was, I think somebody, and in fact, there are, I think, some books now coming out about women who served in Vietnam. So you're starting to see more of that, more those women getting their due as well. And then Desert Storm as well. There were some great experiences in there that I had to cut out just because, that chapter is already 10,000 words long. So there are obviously quite a few things in there, that I had to either just summarize or, cut out completely because I just ran out of room. So, yeah.
Is that in your back matter? You have great back matter, by the way. I always love back matter in books. And you've got a couple of appendices that I thought were really fun. One is talks about what a military career looks like for somebody who maybe doesn't know. I thought that was great. And then there's one that gives us the dates, like of major events, like a timeline.
Yeah, unfortunately, that book is not in because I didn't actually use it. So I have a bibliography. So yeah, unfortunately, I did not list that book. So yeah.
Okay, well, I'll get the title from you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think it's called Angel's Truck Stop. She's not a pilot, but she's working with all these pilots, So,
well, you've piqued my interest now in that period of history that is sort of a gap for women in aviation, but like their contributions again were what got us back in the door. So, so now I'm interested in that history too. So even if they're not aviators, so it's okay. I do read other things. I know that sounds shocking. I do actually read other stuff than just women in aviation. So this is not your first published book. You have a couple of others. Can you tell us about those?
Yes, so they're not about women in aviation. So they're, they don't totally qualify for your series here. The first book is called The Propeller Under the Bed, A Personal History of Home-Built Aircraft. And it started out as just a story about my dad, who designed an airplane when he was in college to set a world record, an aviation world record, a distance record. And it took him 50 years, but he finally got around to building the airplane and setting the record when he was 82 years old. And so he flew across the country from Everett, Washington to Fredericksburg, Virginia, nonstop, so setting that distance record. So it started out as kind of that journey, but it also weaves in the history of home-built aircraft in the United States, which really began in earnest back right after Lindbergh did his flight. There was sort of this aviation craze that took over the U.S. And so it weaves in that whole history from the late 1920s on. And I just was fascinated by how much the home building industry really influenced general aviation in the U.S. and just all of the innovation that's gone on in that industry for the last 60, 70 years. So it kind of weaves those two stories together. And then,
yeah, and I can imagine that book is very popular with the EAA, which I know you're a member of and participate in. Tell us about your involvement with EAA.
Yeah, so EAA, Experimental Aircraft Association, they obviously focus on home built aircraft, but they really are sort of an advocate for general aviation, in general. So they have a program called the Young Eagles program, where they fly young folks, I think up to 8 to 17 is the age group, to introduce them to aviation. So they're not just about advocacy for home built aircraft and resources for home built aircraft. They are like general aviation, trying to promote aviation in the United States. I've been a member for 30 years now. And I'd say about the last 10 years, I've been, more involved with them, giving presentations at their annual, their big fly-in they have the week-long fly-in in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. So if you haven't been, you need to go. I guess that's all
on my list. It's on my list.
Yeah, it's the most amazing aviation event on the planet, I think. So yeah, and I highly recommend going. And the other thing they have they call it AirVenture. The other thing they have at AirVenture now is Wednesdays. They have what's called Women Venture. And I've been involved in that for a few years. And they bring in women speakers. They celebrate women in aviation, basically. And they also now, they just started it last year. They have a separate tent or a separate area where they, again, that is devoted to women in aviation. So they're doing a lot. They're doing their part to try to help bring more women into aviation as well. So.
That's awesome. And then you have your other history book. Tell us about
my second book was Unforgotten in the Gulf of Tonkin. And now I can't remember the subtitle, but it's basically the story of a rescue of a Navy pilot in Vietnam who was hit over North Vietnam, made it out over the Gulf of Tonkin, and had a pretty wild rescue. And so it's not just about his story, though. It weaves in two stories. It weaves in the history of combat search and rescue starting back in World War II and all of the events that led up to, how did all those people and forces get where they were to be able to rescue him that day? So it's not, his rescue drives the story, but it's not just about his rescue. And then it also is about not leaving people behind. It's not just combat search and rescue. It's also MIAs, recovering MIAs, and then and PTSD, making people whole after they come back from war. So it kind of weaves all of those themes together.
So you published these other two books in this one. Can you tell us a little bit about your writing and publishing journey and how that all worked for you?
That started in 2012, actually. I was getting ready to leave government service for a bit, had about a year-long break there before I came back in. And I had always wanted to do some writing. I kind of figured it would be a technical book. I wanted to write a book, actually. And I always figured it would be a technical book because I'd published a lot of technical articles over the years. But I had done some more what we would call creative writing back in my younger days. Even though I'm an engineer, I was always interested in writing.
Oh.
So the first thing I did was I took a couple of online classes from Writer's Digest. They were pretty inexpensive, but that kind of got the creative juices flowing. And it also showed me how much craft is involved in writing. Prior to that, I think I thought you can either write or you can't. And I would sometimes write things down and I'd go, that's terrible. I know it was terrible, but I didn't know how to fix it.
Yeah, that's how I started.
Right, yeah. So taking the classes and just the books, I mean, you can learn a lot about writing. There are tons and tons of books out there. So I had a few of the books. I took a couple of the classes, and the first thing I did was I I actually wrote, I was like, okay, I want to start writing some articles, break in. It's hard to just write a book. It's better if you can write some articles first. So I figured that out. So I wanted to write some articles. So the first article that I wrote was actually the story about getting stuck in the F-16 and having to go to the bathrooms.
So that started off as an article. That's perfect.
Yeah. So, because I told that story many times to people over the years. And actually, when it first happened, I didn't tell anybody about it. I didn't want to admit it. But,
of course
later
not.
on,
Yeah.
I thought, this is kind of funny, And so I started telling people, always laughed. So anyway, I wrote it down, and Air and Space Magazine has a section in it, above and beyond, that you can send them, that you can submit an article to, even if you're not a published author. It's kind of a there I was kind of thing. And so I filled out the form, sent the story in, and I figured I'd never hear anything back. And like 3 days later, I got an email from an editor saying, hey, we want to publish your story. And I was like, what? So,
that's cool.
Yeah. So that kind of got me started. And so that's one version of the story. It's a very edited down version that appeared in the magazine. It was quite a few years ago. So yeah. But that got me started, because it got me a relationship with that editor. And then I started pitching some other stories to her. And then from there, I had a couple credits under my belt. So I started pitching other magazines, and then I started getting the confidence to write a book, So when you do a nonfiction book, you don't actually have to write the whole book. You do a book proposal. So again, I took a couple classes on writing book proposals. I worked with some folks and started working my way through the process. I tried to get an agent initially, wasn't able to get one for that first book, but I got University of Washington Press. I'm a UW alumni, so that probably helped get my foot in the door.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So I got that first book published with them. And then from there, the second book, I was able actually to get an agent. And then, things have just kind of gone from there. So it's been quite the journey. It's hard for me to believe it was almost 11 years ago I started this. So it takes a while. Yeah. There are people who, just write that first book and that's all they do, and they have a great success. But I think more people have a journey like I do. You start small and kind of build your credentials over time.
Yeah, you said two things there that I just want to reemphasize. The article thing, to get your foot in the door with writing and get something out there and published and practice. I started off that way with the Aviation for Women magazine, and because I established that relationship while I was on active duty and established some credibility with them, I was able to reignite that relationship when I started this project. And so, it gives me the opportunity to promote all of your books to their audience. So that's great. And, I'll keep working my way around the magazines and see where else I can get our stories out there.
Yeah.
But then also the university press thing. I love that. I think not everybody thinks of that when they have a book that they want to publish. Just remember that they're, especially for nonfiction, finding a fit with the university press is not, you don't have to be an alum from the school, right. Especially state, if you're writing a biography about somebody from a particular state, that state university might be interested in preserving that history and would help you or consider publishing. So those are great points. Thank you.
Yeah. There's also a lot of small presses out there too that you don't have to have an agent for. So yeah. And they tend to be more literary. So again, it just depends on how literary, if you have a very literary work, you might be able to approach a small press. So, but there's lots of options. Yeah.
Yep. That's great. Now, that's a perfect segue into a very lovely message that you have at the end of your epilogue in the book. And I wanted, it's not spoiling anything for you to read the last paragraph. Would you read it for us?
Sure. Just as my generation stood on the shoulders of the Fly Girls from a century ago, I hope this book will inspire younger women to consider careers in aviation and the military. I also hope it will inspire women of my generation to write their own stories. There are thousands of stories waiting to be told, and millions of young girls waiting to be inspired.
Oh, I get goosebumps when I hear that. Thousands of stories waiting to be told and millions of girls waiting to be inspired. Write your stories, ladies, and write the stories of other people too. And I just love your book. I'm so excited for you. Congratulations. And we'll be discussing the book in July in the Aviatrix Book Club. Please, everybody, join us. Thank you, Eileen, for your work and for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much, Liz.
Thanks so much for listening. I'd like to thank Michael Wilds and Shasta Ways of the Women Soar Group for their help in producing this interview. The Women Soar Group is a media company that gives women a platform to express themselves. Blue skies and happy reading. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Coming Home Well, for your collaboration in helping these stories reach a broader audience. Writing is a deeply healing and cathartic exercise. It can help you process your experiences, whether you intend to share them with the world or keep them to yourself. Living the experiences of others through reading can also help heal, validate, and create a sense of connectedness. If you're interested in hearing about how these authors brought their stories to life on the page, check out the Writer's Room interviews on the Aviatrix Book Review website and podcast. If you'd like to join the book club conversations, look for the Aviatrix Book Club on Facebook. All are welcome. And connect with me on social media at Literary Aviatrix. I'd love to hear from you. Blue skies and happy reading.